A millionaire makes his black maid serve guests at a gala, unaware that she's a well-known chef. Her culinary skills leave the guests in awe, causing a reversal of roles as he becomes the one embarrassed. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The warm glow of chandeliers illuminated the marble foyer of Brad Thompson's mansion as black-tied waiters weaved through clusters of arriving guests. Brad stood at the entrance, a practiced smile fixed on his face as he greeted each newcomer. His 6-foot frame was wrapped in a perfectly tailored Italian suit, and his silver-streaked hair was expertly styled, every detail calculated to project success and authority. "Welcome to my home," he repeated, shaking hands with CEOs, local politicians, and society figures. His eyes constantly scanned the room, ensuring everything met his exacting standards. The crystal glasses sparkled, the flowers were perfectly arranged, and soft classical music drifted through hidden speakers. This wasn't just a party. It was a demonstration of his position in society. Meanwhile, in the bustling kitchen, Maya Johnson moved with precise efficiency. Her hands were steady as she drizzled sauce over perfectly seared scallops, her dark eyes focused intently on the plate before her. The kitchen staff orbited around her like planets around a sun, following her quiet but firm directions. Despite the heat and pressure, Maya maintained absolute control over her domain. 5 minutes until the first course, she called out, her voice carrying authority without raising its volume. The kitchen responded with a chorus of "Yes, chef," though technically that wasn't her title. Not here, anyway. Here, she was officially just the cook, despite her culinary school training and years of restaurant experience. Back in the main hall, Brad was deep in conversation with Richard Maxwell, a potential investor. "The view of the bay is spectacular, especially at sunset," Brad said, gesturing toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. "I had the entire West Wing renovated last year." He conveniently failed to mention the construction had gone over budget, cutting into funds he'd promised for kitchen upgrades. The first trays of hors d'oeuvres began circulating through the crowd. Maya watched from the kitchen doorway as guests sampled her creations. She'd chosen each item carefully: duck confit en brioche with fig compote, lobster thermidor in delicate pastry cups, and her signature black truffle arancini. But it was her next dish that made her pulse quicken with anticipation. Hidden in the walk-in cooler was a special course she'd prepared, a modern interpretation of her grandmother's gumbo, refined for fine dining but maintaining the soul of the original recipe. The dish represented everything she was: technical skill merged with cultural heritage and personal history. Brad continued his rounds, accepting compliments about the food with a vague wave of his hand, as if the cuisine had materialized by magic rather than through Maya's skill and dedication. He barely acknowledged the kitchen's existence, let alone its head cook. Maya heard snippets of conversation as she moved between the kitchen and dining room. "These flavors are extraordinary," one woman remarked. "Who's the chef?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as Brad smoothly directed attention to his new art collection. In the kitchen, Maya adjusted the heat under a pot of sauce and checked the temperature of the proteins resting nearby. Every element had to be perfect. She knew opportunities like this, with influential food critics and restaurant owners in attendance, were rare. Despite her position as just the cook, she refused to deliver anything less than excellence. The kitchen staff watched with admiration as she plated the next course. Her movements were graceful and assured, each garnish placed with artistic precision. Whitey's seen her arrive early every morning to prep, stay late to plan menus, and work tirelessly to maintain standards that went far beyond what was expected of a private household cook. As the evening progressed, the gap between the glittering front of house and the working kitchen became increasingly stark. Brad held court among his guests, basking in their admiration of his wealth and taste, while Maya orchestrated a symphony of flavors that would ultimately steal the spotlight, though he didn't know it yet. Maya straightened her chef's coat and took a deep breath. The next course would be her tribute to her heritage, a bold move in this setting. The dish was more than food. It was a statement about who she was and what she could achieve. As she began plating, Her movements were confident and purposeful. Tonight, whether Brad Thompson realized it or not, his guests were about to experience something extraordinary. The grand dining room buzzed with conversation as servers presented Maya's first signature dish of the evening. Sarah Chun, a renowned food critic known for her sharp palate and sharper pen, was the first to notice something different. She paused mid-conversation, her fork hovering over the plate as she studied the composition before her. "This is remarkable," Sarah said, loud enough to draw attention from nearby diners. "The balance of flavors, the technique. This isn't just good cooking, this is artistry." Her words carried weight. Sarah's reviews had the power to make or break even established restaurants. The dining room's crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the long mahogany table as other guests began to sample their plates. Murmurs of appreciation spread through the room. Brad, seated at the head of the table, shifted uncomfortably in his chair as he watched the reactions unfold. He'd hired Maya 3 years ago on a recommendation, viewing her simply as household staff, competent but unremarkable. "Brad, darling," called out Elizabeth Rothschild from 3 seats down, "you've been holding out on us. Where did you find this chef?" She emphasized the word chef, and Brad felt a flicker of annoyance. Maya was his cook, not his chef. There was a distinction, wasn't there? "The kitchen staff has been with me for some time," he replied vaguely, taking a sip of his Bordeaux. But Sarah Chin wasn't about to let the subject drop so easily. "This dish shows a sophisticated understanding of classical French techniques," Sarah observed, setting down her fork. "But there's something more, a personal touch, a unique perspective that elevates it beyond traditional fine dining." She turned her penetrating gaze toward Brad. "Your cook must have an interesting background." Brad dabbed his mouth with his napkin, buying time. The truth was he realized he knew very little about Maya's background. She'd presented excellent references, worked efficiently, and never caused problems. Exactly what he wanted from his staff. He'd never bothered to learn more. "The preparation is excellent, isn't it?" He deflected, but Sarah wasn't finished. "When I wrote my piece on emerging culinary talents last month, I discussed how personal heritage and classical training can create extraordinary fusion cuisine. This," she gestured to her plate, "this is exactly what I was talking about. Brad, you should be featuring your chef's talents more prominently." The word chef again. Brad felt his jaw tighten. "Maya handles our day-to-day cooking needs very capably," he said, his tone carefully measured. Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. "Maya? Would that be Maya Johnson?" A spark of recognition crossed her face. Wasn't she a rising star at Le Petit Jardin before it closed? Brad blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't known that about Maya's background. Around the table, other guests were now fully engaged in the conversation, their attention drawn away from his carefully planned talking points about his recent business successes. "The technique, UE in this sauce," Sarah continued, clearly warming to her subject. "It reminds me of Marcus Wellington's work, but with a distinctive twist." Did she train under him? Brad's discomfort grew. He prided himself on being in control, on knowing everything that happened in his home. Yet here was Sarah Chun, explaining his own employee's background to him. Worse, other guests were leaning in, genuinely interested in hearing more about Maya, rather than admiring his recent yacht purchase or the rare wines he'd selected for dinner. "Perhaps we should discuss the remarkable vintage I've chosen to pair with this course," Brad attempted, but for once, his guests weren't following his conversational lead. Sarah stood up, wine glass in hand. "I simply must compliment the chef personally." "Brad, you don't mind if I pop into the kitchen, do you?" Her question was merely courteous. She was already moving toward the kitchen door. Brad watched her go, acutely aware that he was losing control of his carefully orchestrated evening. The whispers around the table grew louder, and he caught fragments of conversation about Maya's previous work, her training, her potential. How had his quiet, efficient cook become the center of attention at his gala? In that moment, Brad realized that while he'd been focused on maintaining his image as the perfect host, something extraordinary had been happening right under his nose. And now, as his guests' attention drifted toward the kitchen door where Sarah had disappeared, he felt an unfamiliar sensation, irrelevance. The uncomfortable moment was broken by Mark Davidson's loud voice cutting through the dining room. Come on, Brad. Don't tell me your help is stealing the show tonight. Mark's laughter boomed across the table, encouraging several others to join in nervously. He was Brad's friend from college, known for his inability to read a room and his outdated views that he masked his jokes. I mean, she's good at following recipes, sure, Mark continued, swirling his wine glass. But let's not get carried away here. What's next? Are we going to start asking the gardener for landscape architecture advice? More awkward laughter followed, but notably less this time. Brad found himself at a crossroads. Normally, he would have joined in with Mark's jokes, maintaining the social hierarchy he'd always taken for granted. Instead, he felt a creeping discomfort. Mark, he started, then paused, unsure how to continue. The silence stretched uncomfortably. In the kitchen, Maya could hear the laughter through the doors. She'd learned long ago to tune out such comments, to focus instead on her work. Her hands moved steadily as she prepared the next course, each movement precise and purposeful. The kitchen staff watched her with a mixture of concern and admiration, seeing the slight tightening of her jaw, the only indication that she'd heard Mark's words. "Chef," one of the younger line cooks whispered, using the title the kitchen staff always used when Brad wasn't around. "You don't have to pass me the micro-herbs," Maya interrupted quietly, her focus unwavering. She was already plating her next creation, a deconstructed version of her aunt's Sunday roast, elevated with modern techniques and elegant presentation. Each plate told a story, her story, whether the dining room was ready to hear it or not. Back in the dining room, Sarah Chun had returned, and her expression made it clear she'd heard Mark's comment. "Actually," she said, her voice carrying that journalist's knack for commanding attention, "I was just discussing with Maya her innovative approach to classical French techniques. Her training under Marcus Wellington is evident, but she's developed something entirely her own. It's fascinating, really." "Marcus Wellington?" Mark interrupted. "The Marcus Wellington? Brad, did you know about this?" Brad shifted in his seat, acutely aware of all eyes on him. Well, Maya's references were excellent, of course, he managed, feeling increasingly out of his depth. Sarah pressed on, either oblivious to or deliberately ignoring the tension. "What I find particularly interesting is her integration of African-American culinary traditions with classical European techniques. It's exactly the kind of fusion that's revolutionizing fine dining." The servers began entering with the next course, their movements choreographed with military precision, another testament to Maya's leadership in the kitchen. The plates they set down were works of art, sophisticated, elegant, yet somehow warmly inviting. Mark, never one to read the room, couldn't help himself. "Well, sure, but it's just cooking, right? I mean, my grandmother made great food too, but you don't see her running a kitchen at La Bernardine." The silence that followed was deafening. Brad opened his mouth to say something, anything, to salvage the situation, but found himself speechless. He'd always prided himself on being a gracious host, on controlling every aspect of his social gatherings. Now, watching his closest friend make increasingly inappropriate comments about his talented chef, he felt the control slipping away. In the kitchen, Maya continued her work, channeling her energy into her next creation. She'd faced countless marks throughout her career, had heard every dismissive comment, had been passed over for promotions despite her superior skills. But tonight was different. Tonight, her food was speaking for her, telling her story in a way that no one could dismiss or diminish. The kitchen staff moved around her with increased determination, their loyalty evident in every precise movement. They'd seen Maya's daily dedication, her unwavering standards, her quiet dignity in the face of dismissal and disrespect. Tonight, as her culinary creations commanded the attention of some of the city's most influential dining figures, they shared in her triumph. As the evening progressed, the divide between the kitchen and dining room began to dissolve. Maya's dishes weren't just meals. They were statements, each plate challenging preconceptions about what belonged in fine dining. And while Mark's words still hung in the air, they seemed increasingly hollow in the face of such undeniable talent. Brad, watching this transformation unfold, felt something shift in his understanding. He'd always seen his home as a showcase for his success, his dinner parties as celebrations of his achievements. But tonight, real artistry was emerging from his kitchen, and he had nothing to do with it. The realization was both humbling and strangely enlightening. In the quiet moments between courses, Maya's hands moved automatically through familiar motions while her mind drifted back. She remembered standing on a wooden stool in her grandmother's kitchen at age 6, barely tall enough to reach the counter, watching skilled hands transform simple ingredients into magic. Cooking isn't just about feeding people, her grandmother had told her. It's about feeding their souls. The memory was interrupted by the sound of Sarah Chen's voice at the kitchen door. Maya, that last course was extraordinary. The way you incorporated your grandmother's techniques. Maya looked up surprised. You could tell. The spice blend, the layering of flavors. It's distinct. But you've elevated it to something entirely new. Sarah paused, watching Maya work. You were on track to open your own restaurant before Le Petit Jardin closed, weren't you? Maya's hands stilled for a moment. For years ago, she'd been weeks away from securing investors for her own place. Then the economic downturn hit. Le Petit Jardin shut its doors, and her investors pulled out. Taking the position as Brad's cook was supposed to be temporary, a way to stay in the industry while regrouping. Somehow, temporary had stretched into years. In the dining room, Brad was having his own moment of reflection. He listened as guests discussed Maya's previous work piecing together a story he should have known. She trained at the Culinary Institute of America, apprenticed under renowned chefs in France, and earned critical acclaim as sous chef at Le Petit Jardin, all before ending up in his kitchen, where he'd treated her as little more than household staff. The pressure was always there, he overheard Sarah telling another guest. In high-end kitchens, being a woman of color meant having to be twice as good just to be considered equal. Maya's talent couldn't be denied, but the industry has its own ways of closing doors. Brad felt a familiar squeeze in his chest, the same pressure he'd felt growing up, trying to prove himself worthy of his family's name and fortune. Always performing, always perfect, never quite feeling like enough. He'd built his walls high, surrounded himself with luxury and status symbols, created a world where he made the rules. Maya's voice drifted from the kitchen as she explained a dish to her staff. Her tone was clear, patient, authoritative, the voice of someone who knew exactly who they were and what they were capable of. Despite everything the industry had thrown at her, she'd never lost her passion or compromised her standards. The first thing I learned in culinary school, Maya told her attentive kitchen staff, was that technique is crucial, but soul is irreplaceable. Every dish needs both to be truly exceptional. She demonstrated a plating technique, her movements precise but natural, earned through years of dedication. Brad found himself drawn to the kitchen door, watching unnoticed. He saw how the staff responded to her leadership, how they anticipated her needs, the respect in their eyes when they called her chef, a title he'd never used. He thought about his own approach to leadership, built on hierarchy and authority rather than earned respect. In the dining room, conversations continued to revolve around Maya's journey and her unique culinary perspective. Brad heard snippets about her time in France, her innovations at Le Petit Jardin, the glowing reviews she'd received. All achievements he'd never bothered to discover about someone who worked in his home every day. Maya was now plating her next course, a dish that combined classical French techniques with flavors from her childhood. Each plate was a piece of her story. The grandmother who taught her to cook with love, the mother who encouraged her to dream big, the years of training and sacrifice, the setbacks and resilience. The kitchen moved in perfect synchronization around her, like a well-rehearsed orchestra. Her quiet confidence had nothing to do with wealth or status. It came from expertise, dedication, and an unwavering belief in her craft. Brad watched as she inspected each plate before it left the kitchen, her standards higher than any he could have imposed. For the first time, Brad saw clearly what had been right in front of him. While he'd been focused on maintaining his image of success, real excellence had been quietly flourishing in his kitchen. Maya wasn't just cooking. She was creating art, sharing culture, telling stories through food. And he, despite all his wealth and influence, had nearly missed it entirely. The realization left him feeling both humbled and oddly liberated. Perhaps there was more to success than the carefully constructed image he'd spent his life maintaining. As he watched Maya work, he began to understand that true excellence speaks for itself. No grand announcements or social posturing required. Ladies and gentlemen, Naomi Reynolds, a well-known restaurant owner, stood with her wine glass raised. I believe we're all wondering about the extraordinary culinary journey we're experiencing tonight. Perhaps, she glanced meaningfully toward the kitchen, we could hear from the creator herself? A murmur of agreement rippled through the dining room. Brad felt his control of the evening slipping further away. This wasn't how his galas usually proceeded. Nor, Mally, the conversation centered around business deals, social connections, and his latest acquisitions. The kitchen staff was meant to be invisible, efficient but unnoticed. I don't think, Brad started, but Sarachan cut him off smoothly. Maya, would you join us for a moment? Sarah called out, her voice carrying authority that even Brad hesitated to challenge. In the kitchen, Maya paused. She'd spent years in the background, letting her food speak for her. But tonight felt different. The next course was her grandmother's recipe reimagined, a dish that held not just flavors but history, culture, and personal meaning. Perhaps it was time to step forward. The next course will be ready in 3 minutes, Maya told her staff, removing her apron. The kitchen team nodded, already moving with practiced precision to finish the plating. They'd been waiting for this moment, knowing their chef deserved recognition. Brad watched Maya emerge from the kitchen, her chef's coat crisp despite hours of work. She carried herself with quiet dignity, no trace of the servitude he'd unconsciously expected from his staff. The dining room fell silent, all eyes drawn to her presence. The next course, Maya began, her voice clear and steady, is inspired by a dish my grandmother used to make. She paused, and Brad expected her to falter under the attention of his wealthy, influential guests. Instead, she stood straighter. In her kitchen, I learned that food is more than sustenance. It's a bridge between cultures, a keeper of history, a way to honor both tradition and innovation. The room was captivated. Even Mark had stopped fidgeting with his phone. Brad found himself sinking deeper into his chair, memories washing over him. How many times had Maya served his guests without acknowledgement? How many compliments had he accepted for her work without passing them on? He'd been so focused on maintaining his position that he'd failed to recognize the talent and artistry right in front of him. This dish combines classical French techniques I learned at the Culinary Institute of America with flavors and methods passed down through generations of my family, Maya continued. The demi-glace is traditional, but the spice blend is my grandmother's secret recipe, one she taught me when I was barely tall enough to reach the stove. The servers began presenting the course, moving with the precision Maya had instilled in them. Each plate was a work of art, the presentation modern and sophisticated while honoring the soul of the original dish. The braised short ribs are cooked for 48 hours, Maya explained, her passion evident in every word. The technique is French, but the seasoning blend is African-American soul food tradition. The garnish includes fresh herbs from our kitchen garden, which we maintain using sustainable practices. Brad noticed several guests taking notes. These were people he'd been trying to impress for years with his wine cellar and art collection. Now they were completely engaged by his cook. No, he corrected himself mentally, by this talented chef he'd failed to recognize. What made you choose this particular dish for tonight? Sarachan asked, genuine interest in her voice. Maya's answer was thoughtful. In fine dining, we sometimes forget that the most elevated cuisine often has humble origins. This dish represents a bridge between my formal training and my cultural heritage. It's a reminder that excellence can come from anywhere if we're willing to recognize it. The subtle message wasn't lost on Brad. He saw heads nodding around the table, saw the respect in his guests' eyes. Not the polite deference they showed to wealth, but genuine admiration for skill and artistry. Chef Johnson, Naomi Reynolds spoke up, using the title naturally. I believe you've given us all something to think about, and not just about food. The moment hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Brad looked around his opulent dining room, seeing it differently now. All his carefully curated symbols of success seemed somehow hollow compared to the authentic mastery Maya had demonstrated. He'd spent years building walls of wealth and privilege, only to find that true excellence had been quietly working in his kitchen all along. As Maya returned to her domain, Brad noticed something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. His guests weren't just eating dinner anymore. They were experiencing something authentic, something meaningful. And for the first time in his carefully managed life, he found himself grateful to not be the center of attention. The dining room fell into an expectant hush as Maya began to explain the inspiration behind her signature dish. Her voice, though quiet, carried an unmistakable authority born from years of expertise and genuine passion. "This dish represents a journey," Maya began, standing tall despite years of being asked to make herself small. "The base is a traditional French cassoulet, but I've incorporated ingredients that tell my family's story. The black-eyed peas are a nod to my great-grandmother, who grew them in her garden in Georgia. The spice blend has been passed down through 4 generations of my family." Brad watched, transfixed, as his normally reserved cook commanded the attention of some of the city's most influential people. These were individuals who regularly dined at Michelin-starred restaurants, who considered themselves culinary sophisticates. Yet they leaned forward, completely absorbed in Maya's explanation of how she'd transformed humble ingredients into haute cuisine. "The smoking technique I learned while training under Chef Wellington in Paris," Maya continued. "But the flavor profile comes from watching my grandmother smoke meat behind her restaurant in Memphis. She taught me that technique without soul is just mechanical motion." Sarah Chen nodded appreciatively. "The fusion is seamless. You've managed to honor both traditions while creating something entirely new." Maya's hands moved as she spoke, illustrating her points with the same precision she used in cooking. Each element on the plate has a purpose, both in flavor and in story. The pickled vegetables, for instance, use my mother's recipe, but I've adapted the presentation using techniques I learned at Le Petit Jardin. The silence in the room was profound. Even the servers had paused to listen, recognition and pride evident in their expressions. These were the stories they'd heard pieces of in the kitchen, now being shared with people who could truly appreciate their significance. "In many high-end kitchens," Maya continued, her voice steady despite the weight of her words, "I was told to stick to classical techniques, to forget my roots. But I've learned that true innovation comes from embracing all parts of who you are." Brad felt each word like a gentle rebuke. How many times had he emphasized the French wines in his cellar while overlooking the artistry in his kitchen? How often had he directed Maya to prepare traditional dishes for his guests, never considering that her own traditions might offer something extraordinary? "The sauce," Maya explained, pointing to the rich, glossy reduction that graced each plate, "takes 3 days to prepare. It combines French reduction techniques with flavors my great-aunt taught me to develop. She used to say that patience in the kitchen is like patience in life. You can't rush what needs time to develop properly." Around the table, guests were sampling the dish with new appreciation, discovering layers of flavor that matched the layers of story Maya had shared. Some closed their eyes as they tasted. Others nodded in understanding as complex flavors revealed themselves. "The presentation may look simple," Maya said, gesturing to the elegant plating, "but each element represents hours of preparation and years of learning. In my family, we believe that food should nourish both body and soul. I've tried to bring the tea philosophy into fine dining." Brad watched as several guests dabbed at their eyes, moved not just by the food, but by the meaning behind it. He realized that in all his efforts to impress these people with material wealth, he'd never achieved what Maya had accomplished with simple honesty and undeniable skill. "This isn't just dinner," Maya concluded, her quiet confidence filling the room. "It's a conversation between traditions, between generations, between different ways of understanding what makes food truly exceptional." The silence that followed was broken by spontaneous applause. Not the polite, society applause Brad was used to hearing at his gatherings, but genuine, enthusiastic appreciation. Maya had done more than serve a meal. She'd shared her soul, and in doing so, had transformed his carefully orchestrated display of wealth into something authentically meaningful. As Maya turned to return to her kitchen, Brad caught a glimpse of her expression. There was no triumph there, no smugness or revenge for years of being overlooked. Instead, he saw simple satisfaction, the quiet pride of someone who knew their worth and had finally found the right moment to share it. The kitchen door swung shut behind her, but the impact of her words remained. Brad looked down at his own plate, seeing it with new eyes. Each element represented not just skill but story, not just technique but heritage. He'd been serving fine dining for years, but perhaps only now was he beginning to understand what that truly meant. Maya's moment in the dining room had shattered something in Brad's carefully constructed world. Watching her return to the kitchen, he remained frozen in his chair, processing the profound shift in the room's atmosphere. The usual superficial chatter of his galas had been replaced by genuine, passionate discussions about food, culture, and authenticity. Brad, Sarah Chin's voice cut through his thoughts, her tone both professional and pointed. You've had one of the most talented chefs in the city working in your kitchen. Did you really not know her background? Before he could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal his ignorance, the critic continued. I'd like to feature Maya in my upcoming series on innovative chefs. Her fusion of classical techniques with African-American culinary traditions is exactly what the industry needs right now. Around the table, other influential guests began chiming in. Naomi Reynolds, who owned 3 successful restaurants downtown, was already talking about collaboration opportunities. James Foster, the city's leading restaurant investor, was making notes on his phone. Brad felt the unfamiliar sensation of being peripheral to the conversation at his own dinner party. The strange thing was it didn't sting as much as he would have expected. Instead, he felt a growing sense of shame at how he'd overlooked Maya's talents for so long. Standing abruptly, he excused himself from the table. His feet carried him toward the kitchen, though he wasn't entirely sure what he planned to say. Through the window in the door, he could see Maya directing her team with quiet authority, her movements precise and assured. He pushed through the door, and the kitchen's energy shifted subtly. Staff members who normally snapped to attention at his presence kept working, their loyalty clearly lying with their chef. Maya looked up briefly, but continued garnishing a plate. Maya, he started, then paused. In all the years she'd worked for him, had he ever really spoken to her as one professional to another? That was extraordinary. Not just the food, but everything you shared about your journey, your heritage. She placed the final garnish with practiced precision before meeting his gaze. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Her tone was professional, neither seeking approval nor showing resentment. I owe you an apology, Brad continued, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He searched for the right word, blind. Deliberately blind, perhaps. Maya's hands stilled for a moment. The kitchen around them had grown quiet, though preparation continued. We all have blind spots, she said carefully. The important thing is what we do when they're revealed to us. The wisdom in her words struck him. How many other things had he refused to see in his determination to maintain his position and power? How many talents had he overlooked? How many stories had he dismissed? Sarah Chun wants to feature you in her next series, he said. And I heard Naomi Reynolds talking about collaboration opportunities. A slight smile crossed Maya's face. I heard. She turned to inspect another plate. Life is a way of coming full circle. I almost had my own restaurant once, before Le Petit Jardin closed. I didn't know that, Brad admitted, though by now that phrase felt painfully redundant. There's a lot you didn't know, Maya said simply, without accusation. But maybe that's changing now. The kitchen door swung open as Sarah Chin entered, her notepad already in hand. Maya, I need to know more about your vision. The way you've merged these culinary traditions, it's revolutionary. Brad stepped back, watching as Maya discussed her craft with someone who truly understood it. Her face lit up as she explained her techniques, her philosophy, her dreams. This was Maya in her element, not hidden away in his kitchen, but sharing her gifts with the world. The evening's power dynamics had shifted irrevocably. But as Brad observed Maya's interaction with Sarah, he realized something surprising. Letting go of control felt oddly liberating. For years, he'd measured his worth by his ability to impress others with his wealth and influence. Now he was witnessing true mastery, and it had nothing to do with money or social status. As he slipped out of the kitchen, he heard Maya describing her plans for future dishes, her voice confident and passionate. She'd always had this voice, he realized. He just hadn't been willing to hear it until now. The remainder of the evening took on a different character than any previous gala at the Thompson Mansion. The usual discussions of stock portfolios and real estate deals had been replaced by animated conversations about cuisine, culture, and authenticity. Brad found himself on the periphery of these discussions, a novel position that offered him an unexpected perspective. "I'm serious about featuring Maya's work," Sarah Chun was saying to a small group of captivated listeners. "The industry needs more voices like hers. Chefs who can bridge traditional techniques with personal heritage in meaningful ways." Brad, hovering at the edge of the conversation, found himself drawn to Sarah. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly, gesturing toward his study. Sarah followed him, her journalist's instincts clearly sensing a story. Inside the book-lined room, Brad sank into his leather chair, feeling the weight of his realizations. "I've been the owner of this house for 15 years, he began, "and I've prided myself on recognizing quality in everything. The art, the wine, the furnishings." He gestured at the carefully curated surroundings. "But I completely failed to see what was right in front of me." Sarah studied him thoughtfully. "You're not the first employer to overlook talent because it didn't fit your preconceptions," she said, her tone professional but not unkind. "The question is, what are you going to do now that you see it?" The question hung in the air. Through the study's open door, they could hear the continued buzz of conversation, punctuated by occasional exclamations of delight as Maya's dessert course was served. "I've spent my life building walls," Brad admitted, surprising himself with his candor. "Wealth, status, social connections, they were all ways of proving my worth. Maya achieved more tonight with simple honesty and skill than I have with all my carefully orchestrated displays." Sarah's pen moved across. As her notepad. "You know, the most interesting stories aren't about people who never make mistakes. They're about people who learn from them." Back in the dining room, guests were discussing Maya's techniques with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for fine art or wine vintages. Traditional power dynamics had dissolved. Wealth and status had taken a back seat to genuine talent and authenticity. "The way she incorporates her family traditions while maintaining classical techniques," one guest was saying, "it's like watching someone write poetry with food." Another added, "And did you notice how each course told a story? Not just about flavor, but about history, about culture, about personal journey." Brad listened, really listened to these conversations. He'd spent years cultivating an image of sophistication, but Maya had shown him what true sophistication looked like, not as a performance of status, but as a genuine expression of skill and heritage. One of the younger guests, a food blogger with a significant following, was already composing a post about the evening. "This is going to change people's perceptions of what fine dining can be," she said excitedly. "It's not just about expensive ingredients and fancy presentations. It's about soul, about authenticity." The word authenticity struck Brad particularly hard. How much of his life had been performance rather than authentic expression? How many talented people had he overlooked because they didn't fit his narrow definition of success? Maya appeared briefly to present the final course, and the room once again fell into appreciative silence. She explained the dessert, a sophisticated reimagining of her mother's sweet potato pie, transformed through French pastry techniques but maintaining its cultural soul. As Brad watched her, he saw what he had missed for so long. True confidence, not built on external validation, but on deep knowledge and passionate dedication to one's craft. It was so different from his own carefully constructed facade of success. The evening was winding down, but it was clear that something new was beginning. Brad could see it in the business cards being exchanged, in the earnest discussions about pop-up dinner opportunities and guest chef appearances. Maya's world was expanding beyond his kitchen, and surprisingly, he felt not loss, but a strange sense of pride, not in himself, but in having been present for this transformation, even if he'd been blind to its possibility for so long. As the evening drew to a close, Sarah Chun approached Maya with a business card held between perfectly manicured fingers. "The annual Bay Area Food Festival is in 3 months," she said. It's invitation only for chefs, but I sit on the selection committee. Your fusion of traditional soul food with classical French techniques would be perfect for our Innovation in Cuisine showcase. Maya accepted the card with steady hands, though her pulse quickened. The festival was legendary in culinary circles, a career-launching platform she dreamed of accessing when she was still at Le Petit Jardin. "That's very kind of you," she began professionally, but Sarah cut her off. "This isn't kindness, Maya. This is recognition of exceptional talent. The festival needs voices like yours, chefs who can demonstrate that fine dining isn't just about European traditions." From across the room, Brad watched the exchange. The festival was one he'd attended as a guest many times, always proud to secure an invitation to such an exclusive event. Now he realized he'd been viewing it all wrong, focusing on the prestige of attending rather than the artistry being celebrated. He made his way over just as Sarah was explaining the festival's requirements. "Each chef needs to prepare a showcase menu for 300 guests," Sarah was saying. "It's a significant undertaking. You'll need time to prepare, a team to support you, proper equipment." "Maya can use my kitchen," Brad found himself saying. Both women turned to look at him, surprise evident on their faces. "For practice, preparation, whatever you need. And I'll cover any equipment or staffing costs." Maya's expression remained carefully neutral. "Mr. Thompson, that's not necessary. Please," he interrupted, then caught himself. Old habits of taking control died hard. He took a breath and tried again. I would be honored if you would accept my support. What you created tonight, it was extraordinary. And I've been lucky enough to have you cooking in my kitchen for 3 years without properly appreciating your talent. Let me help make up for that." Sarah watched this exchange with keen interest, her journalist's instincts noting the power shift happening before her. Here was Brad Thompson, known for his careful control of every situation, offering support without attempting to maintain control. Maya studied Brad's face for a long moment. "The festival requires a significant investment," she said carefully. "Ingredients, staff, equipment. Name what you need," Brad replied simply. "No strings attached. This is your vision, your talent. I'm just offering resources to help make it happen." The last guests were gathering their coats, but the real drama was unfolding in this quiet corner of the room. Maya had spent years tempering her ambitions, adjusting her dreams to fit the practical constraints of her situation. Now, suddenly, doors were opening, but they were being held open by the same man who had, however unintentionally, kept her confined to his private kitchen. "Why?" she asked finally, her direct gaze meeting Brad's. Brad felt the weight of that single word. "Because I was wrong," he said simply. "I've spent years thinking I was supporting fine dining by hosting elaborate dinner parties. But tonight showed me what true culinary artistry looks like. Your food doesn't just feed people, it tells stories, it bridges cultures, it creates connections. That deserves to be shared with the world." Sarah nodded approvingly, but Maya wasn't quite finished. "And you're prepared to lose your private chef?" The question hung in the air. Brad hadn't thought that far ahead, but of course, success at the festival would inevitably lead to opportunities. Maya wouldn't remain his employee forever. Surprisingly, the thought didn't bother him as much as it might have earlier that evening. "I'm prepared to support an extraordinary chef in pursuing her dreams," he replied. "Whatever that means." Maya's expression softened slightly. "I'll need to think about it," she said finally. "This isn't just about cooking anymore. It's about representation, about showing that fine dining can embrace different cultural traditions while maintaining excellence." "Take all the time you need," Brad responded, then added with a small smile, though preferably before Sarah's festival deadline. For the first time that evening, Maya allowed herself a genuine smile. "I'll have my answer for you tomorrow," she said. "After all, I've had 3 years to think about what I'd do with an opportunity like this." As the last guest departed, the massive house felt different somehow. The carefully curated displays of wealth seemed less important than the lingering aromas from Maya's cooking, the echoes of genuine conversations about food and culture, the sense that something authentic had finally broken through the polished facade of Brad's world. The following morning, Brad sat in his study, staring at financial reports he'd been avoiding. The numbers were clear. His company was facing significant challenges. Market volatility had hit harder than expected, and several key investments had underperformed. His carefully constructed empire was showing cracks. The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Maya, arriving earlier than usual, carrying a folder instead of her usual chef's bag. Brad felt an unfamiliar nervousness. The roles had shifted, and they both knew it. Made my decision, Maya said as she sat across from him, her posture confident but not confrontational. But first, I need to understand something. Why this sudden change? Last night wasn't the first time someone recognized my talent. Brad looked at the financial reports on his desk, then back at Maya. You know what I realized last night? I've spent my entire life trying to prove my worth through wealth and status. But watching you, you proved yours through pure talent and authenticity. It made me question everything. Maya nodded slowly, opening her folder. I've drawn up a proposal, not just for the festival, but for something bigger. She laid out several carefully prepared documents. A culinary academy, one that combines classical training with diverse cultural traditions. Students would learn French techniques alongside soul food, Asian fusion, African cuisine. Brad leaned forward, intrigued despite his financial concerns. An academy? Your company's struggling, isn't it? Maya's directness caught him off guard. I pay attention to business news. But you have something valuable. This house, your connections, and now, hopefully, a vision for something meaningful. The idea began to take shape in Brad's mind. Transform the mansion into a culinary academy. The kitchen is already professional grade. The dining room can host showcase events. The grounds could support an organic garden. Maya's eyes were alight with possibility. And you wouldn't just be another wealthy man with a big house. You'd be part of creating real change in the culinary world. For the first time in weeks, Brad felt genuine excitement. But this would take significant investment, and right now, I've already spoken with some potential investors, Maya revealed. After last night, James Foster is particularly interested. Sarah Chin's article about your transformation from traditional patron to innovative culinary education supporter would attract more. But, she paused meaningfully, it would mean truly letting go of control, trusting in expertise other than your own. Brad looked around his study, at all the symbols of wealth and power he'd accumulated. You know what's strange? The idea of letting go doesn't frighten me as much as it would have yesterday. Good, Maya said firmly, because I have conditions. The academy needs to be accessible to talented students regardless of their background. We need scholarship programs, mentorship opportunities, like the opportunities you didn't have, Brad realized aloud. Exactly. And I want to bring in guest instructors from diverse culinary traditions. Make it a true fusion of classical and cultural expertise. The morning sun streamed through the study windows as they discussed details. With each point, Brad felt his old life receding and something new taking its place. The irony wasn't lost on him. His biggest business success might come from learning to step back and support others' talents. There's one more thing, Maya added, pulling out a final document. The famous chef who called this morning? He wasn't calling to hire me. He wants to collaborate on the academy's curriculum. Apparently, the industry has been waiting for something like this. Brad smiled, recognizing how completely the power dynamic had shifted. So, you'll be my boss? No, Maya corrected him. We'll be partners. You bringing your business expertise and connections, me bringing my culinary knowledge and vision. But it only works if we both understand the true value each brings. Looking at the proposal, Brad realized this was more than a business plan. It was a chance for redemption, for creating something meaningful beyond wealth and status. You know what, he said, extending his hand. I think I'm finally ready to learn from someone else's expertise. Maya shook his hand firmly. Then let's make something extraordinary together. After all, she added with a slight smile, that's what great cuisine is all about, bringing different elements together to create something better than each could be alone. As they began reviewing the details, Brad felt a weight lift from his shoulders. His mansion would no longer be just a symbol of wealth, but a place of learning and transformation. And he would no longer be just a wealthy man with a private chef, but part of something genuinely meaningful. The morning sun continued to rise, casting new light on the study's old walls, much like the new perspective illuminating Brad's understanding of true value, authentic success, and the power of recognizing talent in all its forms.